Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a case today that, really hits home for a lot of people. It's one of those stories that just stays with you. We're going back to 2006 in East St. Louis, Illinois. And the story centers around two lifelong friends, Tiffany Hall and Jamela Tunstall.
This case really highlights how you never truly know someone, even those closest to you. Tiffany and Jamela came from similar backgrounds, faced similar challenges, but their lives took drastically different turns.
Yeah, Jamela was a young mother, 7 months pregnant, actually, when she disappeared. And it wasn't just her. Her three young children vanished with her.
It was a complete mystery. No one knew what happened to them, and then Tiffany enters the picture.
Okay, so tell me more about that. What was Tiffany's role in all of this?
Well, shortly after Jamila and her kids disappear, Tiffany shows up at a local hospital claiming she's just given birth to a stillborn baby.
So, two tragedies unfolding at the same time.
Right, but there were things about Tiffany's story that didn't quite add up. Her behavior at the hospital was, well, let's just say it raised some red flags.
Like, what was so strange about her behavior?
She refused to be examined after the supposed stillbirth, which is pretty unusual. And her story kept changing. She was giving different accounts to different people, almost as if she was trying to distance herself from what had happened.
That's definitely suspicious.
Mm.
It's like she was trying to hide something.
Exactly. And that's where her boyfriend, Keith Horn, comes in.
So he's the one who starts to unravel the truth.
He's a key player for sure. Keith was in the Navy at the time, and he came home specifically for the baby's funeral. He was grieving the loss of what he believed was his daughter. But then Tiffany confesses something to him that changes everything.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. What did she confess?
She tells him that the baby isn't actually hers. She admits to him that she cut the baby out of Jamila.
Oh my God. That's a horrifying confession.
Yeah.
How did Keith react to that?
To his credit, he did the right thing. He immediately contacted the police. It was a brave decision that really got the investigation moving. And tragically, it led to the discovery of Jamila's body.
Where did they find her?
In a vacant lot. She had been bound, and there were scissors found near her body.
So at this point, they have a confirmed homicide and 3 children still missing. What happened next?
The search for those kids intensified. Police went to Jamila's apartment and questioned her partner, Ivan Collins, but there's no sign of them anywhere.
This is where the story takes an even darker turn, right?
Yeah. The children's bodies were eventually found, but it was a gruesome discovery. They were hidden inside Jamila's apartment, in the washing machine and dryer.
Oh my God, I can't even imagine. That's just heartbreaking. Did Tiffany confess to killing the children too?
She did. According to her confession, she had tricked Ivan into letting her take the children a few days earlier, telling him that Jamila wanted to see them and she needed to borrow his car. She then took the children back to her apartment and drowned them one by one in the bathtub.
This is where the premeditation comes in that we talked about earlier, right? Remember how she refused to be examined at the hospital?
Exactly. Weeks before the murders, Tiffany had bought a makeshift birth kit and had been pretending to be pregnant.
Wow. That shows a level of planning and deception that's truly disturbing. But why? Why would she do something like this? Did she ever give a reason?
That's one of the most haunting aspects of this case. Tiffany never offered a clear motive for her actions.
Like there's this big gaping hole in the narrative.
Yeah.
And it's unsettling. It makes you wonder what could possibly drive someone to commit such heinous acts against a friend and innocent children. Could mental illness have been a factor?
It's a question that would loom large as the legal proceedings unfolded.
So this case has so many layers. Friendship, betrayal, violence, and this persistent mystery of motive. It's a lot to unpack.
It definitely is. And as we delve deeper into the legal proceedings and Tiffany's psychological evaluations, you'll see just how intricate and unsettling this case truly becomes.
So Tiffany's confession set off this whole legal battle. It wasn't just about proving she was guilty, right? I mean, they had to try to understand, well, what led her to do this?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, in the legal system, understanding the motive can be just as important as proving the crime itself, especially when there might be mental health issues involved.
So what happened in court? What was Tiffany's plea?
Initially, she pleaded not guilty, but later on, she actually changed her plea to guilty. She ended up admitting to the murders of Jamila and the 3 children.
And with a guilty plea like that, what kind of sentence did she get?
She received a life sentence without parole.
Yeah, given everything that happened, that seems like the only just outcome. But this wasn't the end of it, though, was it?
No, it wasn't. Tiffany's legal team actually filed appeals. They argued that she had, well, they call it ineffective counsel during the initial proceedings.
What does that mean exactly? Ineffective counsel?
Basically, they argued that her lawyer didn't represent her well enough. Maybe they missed some key evidence, didn't call the right witnesses, or just didn't really challenge the prosecution's case effectively.
Okay, I see. So they're saying that if her lawyer had done a better job, maybe the outcome would have been different.
Right, and they also claimed that her mental health wasn't fully evaluated before she entered that guilty plea.
That's a pretty big deal, right? I mean, if her mental state was unstable, could that have impacted her ability to understand what was happening, like the charges against her, or even, how to help in her own defense?
Yeah, absolutely. Her lawyers pointed to a lot of diagnoses. She was diagnosed with a psychotic disorder, PTSD, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and even mild mental retardation.
Wow, that's a lot. So they were saying that these conditions, if they were present at the time of the murders, it could have really affected her judgment.
Exactly, and potentially made it hard for her to control her actions.
So that brings up a big question, right? Like, how does a court decide if someone is mentally competent to stand trial?
Yeah, and what happens if they are deemed incompetent? Does it change how responsible they are for their actions?
It seems like a really tough question to answer.
It is, for sure. It's a complex issue, and there aren't any easy answers. The court has to look at a bunch of things like psychological evaluations, expert opinions, the defendant's own statements, and their behavior. It's a tricky balance. You're trying to make sure the trial is fair, but also hold someone accountable for their actions. You have to recognize that mental illness can truly impact someone's ability to make choices and control their behavior.
It sounds like Tiffany's case really touches on a lot of important issues, not just legal, but psychological and ethical too. Did the court end up agreeing with her lawyers?
Well, yeah, the court eventually reversed its earlier decision to deny her what they call post-conviction relief.
What does that mean? Post-conviction relief.
Basically, it means she was allowed to keep fighting her case. This could potentially lead to a whole new trial or at least a change in her sentence.
So even though she's still in prison, the legal battle is ongoing.
That's right.
So I'm curious, are there any specific precedents or legal standards that might come into play in a case like this? We've talked about ineffective counsel, but what does that really mean in a practical sense?
Well, to prove ineffective counsel, the defense has to show that the lawyer's performance was below a reasonable standard. Like they made significant errors that could have changed the whole outcome of the trial.
Makes sense. But what about the mental health part? Are there any legal standards for evaluating mental competency in a criminal case?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There is a legal standard called competency to stand trial, and that determines if a defendant understands the charges against them, the possible consequences, and whether they can help their lawyer with their defense.
So it's not just about guilt or innocence. It's also about whether the person even understands what's going on in the trial.
Right. It's a protection against convicting someone who might not even understand the legal process. It just adds another layer of complexity to this whole case.
This case really highlights how difficult it is to navigate these legal and ethical issues. But what about the victims in all of this? What about Jamella's family and the community? How have they coped with this tragedy?
It's clear that this case went way beyond just the courtroom, right? I mean, the impact on everyone involved is just huge. We've talked about the legal stuff and how the community reacted, but what about the psychological effects, especially for the people closest to all of this?
The psychological trauma is just immense. For Jamella's family, I mean, losing their loved ones in such a horrific way, it's just unimaginable. And for those who knew both Tiffany and Jamella, the betrayal is so deep, so hard to understand. How could someone they trusted do something so awful?
It's true. That kind of betrayal can really shake your faith in people. It makes you question everything you thought you knew. What about Tiffany? Is there any insight into her state of mind, both when the crimes happened and afterward?
That's where it gets really complicated. We talked about all those diagnoses she received, but it's still not clear how much they really played into her actions. So even with all those mental health issues, there's no definitive answer about whether they were the main reason behind what she did.
Right, and it raises those tough questions about mental health and responsibility in the legal system.
Yeah.
When does mental illness actually lessen someone's blame? How do we balance justice with the understanding that mental illness can really affect judgment and behavior?
Those are tough questions, no doubt. It shows how the legal system, even though it aims to be fair, has to deal with situations that are complicated and morally gray.
It's definitely a balancing act. And in a case like this, where there's no clear motive, it makes finding those answers even harder. We're left with this void, this lack of explanation that just makes it so difficult to grasp why this violence happened.
It's unsettling, that's for sure. We as humans want to find patterns, make sense of things, have some order. But sometimes those things just aren't there, and we're left with more questions than answers.
It reminds us that the human mind is so complex, sometimes impossible to truly understand. And even when something seems senseless, there's always a backstory, a history, experiences that shaped the person. But getting to those layers, figuring out someone's whole life story, it's a huge task.
And in this case, even with Tiffany's confessions and the trials and everything, there's still so much mystery, this feeling of incompleteness.
Yeah.
We may never know for sure what led her to do this.
That's true. And not having those answers can be incredibly difficult, especially for the victims' families. They're left to grieve and try to make sense of something that has no easy explanation.
This case just highlights how devastating violence is, not just for the victims themselves, but for the whole community. It's like a ripple effect that touches everyone, friends, neighbors, even people who didn't know them personally.
It's a powerful reminder that these stories, these cases we talk about, aren't just ideas. They're real lives, real pain, and the very real outcomes of what people do.
Something we can never forget. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the case of Tiffany Hall and Jamela Tunstall and her children, is there a final thought you want to leave with our listeners? Something to think about as they consider this complex and heartbreaking case.
This case really shows us that the world can be unpredictable and unfair. Tragedy can happen when you least expect it, and people we think we know can do terrible things. It makes you realize how precious life is and how important it is to cherish the time we have with those we love.
That's a heavy but very important thought.
Mm.
This deep dive has taken us through a lot of emotions: shock, horror, sadness, confusion. We've talked about complicated legal and psychological ideas and faced the darkness that can be inside people.
Mm.
But we've also seen the resilience of people, the power of community, and the strength of hope, even when facing such a terrible loss.
Exactly. It shows how humans are capable of both great love and terrible loss, compassion and cruelty. We may not have clear answers in this case, but it makes us confront some uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the world.
To everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this difficult but really important journey. We hope you keep exploring these kinds of stories, looking deeper into why people do what they do, and never stop trying to understand, even when things are challenging and heartbreaking.